John Schneider has a rich history of trading down in the NFL draft. Could he pull off his 36th trade, moving down from number 16 overall? Nick Lee and I are going to dive into a bunch of trade scenarios for this upcoming draft here on our Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined here on our Blue Friday episode by my co-host, Nick Lee, and a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s out there. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Whether you're listening in nearby Salem, Oregon, or across the country in Portland, Maine, we greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. Nick, we are diving into some potential trade possibilities on today's show. We know John Schneider's always looking for ways to move down in the draft. He's done it a bunch throughout his tenure in Seattle. And we're going to finish off our March Madness tournament, Seahawks Alumni Edition. We've got Elite Eight, Final Four, and most importantly, the championship game. We're going to wrap up those final 3 rounds today to see which alumni team gets the crown here in 2024. Let's get to it. Now for your lead story here on our Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. John Schneider has rightfully earned a reputation as one of the shrewdest trade masters in the draft process since joining the Seahawks back in 2010. He has made a total of 35 trades during the draft. Now, a lot of those have been trade downs. There have been some trade ups, including to get DK Metcalf a few years back with the New England Patriots. So there's been some successful trade ups for John Schneider in the draft, but he's also traded down a ton. And Nick, going into this first round of the 2024 NFL draft, the Seahawks don't have a top 5 pick this year. They're not picking at number 5 like they did last season with that pick they got from the Russell Wilson trade. They don't pick until 16 overall, but that could be a hot spot for teams in the back half of the first round to trade up this year because there's a lot of good quarterbacks that could go off the board quickly, a lot of offensive players in general. You could have some blue chip defensive players that fall into the mid-teens, which makes this a pick that could have a little bit of a bidding war going on.
Yeah, so my thoughts are, yeah, obviously you want a bidding war. That's definitely the dream scenario. And looking at, I've done tons of mock drafts, and I'm really into it. I like it a lot. There is a sweet spot there at 16 where some tackles start coming off, maybe a few receiver. There's been a few simulations where some of the top receivers maybe start falling into the teens and teams get a little itchy, a little trigger happy there. And we were talking before the show, and tackle and receiver aren't exactly really high on the Seahawks a list at this moment. Maybe not, certainly not in the mid-first round, I'd say. And I'm looking at here at 16 in this draft I got going on here. You still have Johnny Newton here, Jared Verse is there, Amarius Mims is still there, J.C. Latham and Troy Fautano just went off the board at 15 and 14 for me. So really that's right around some teams are going to get itchy to want those guys. And one that, is for trading down, talking scenarios. My first disclaimer is just so it's fresh in our minds because we want to get into the fantasy, Madden style of things. It takes 2 to tango. This ain't Madden forced trade settings.
Yep.
Both teams have to want it. It has to make sense for the team that's trading up to trade up just much as it is for the Seahawks to trade down. So this team has to, whatever team that we're going to talk about, it has to make sense. And my first one that, a matching pair could be the Steelers at 20. I like that positioning there and using that Rich Hill, point system. What made sense was trading down to 20 and then getting also back the 84th pick. So again, this isn't getting a second round pick. That's too rich for the Steelers. They don't want to part with that for just moving down or moving up 4 spots. But I think they are just starving for offensive playmakers, impact players, quarterback, I guess, in a way, if that gets crazy, receiver and tackle for sure. So I like that. What I also like about getting down to 20, Corbin, is, if you find there's also a sweet spot there in 20 where guys like maybe Johnny Newton or maybe even Jackson Powers Johnson still there, or UCLA's Latu, the edge guy, at 20 as well, that could be also a desirable point to where you could trade down again and maybe inch out a possible late round 2 pick.
Yeah, it's possible that could happen. I think in order to get a second round pick, though, Seattle is going to have to move down further than 20. Now, this might be a little too far of a drop for fans to really like, but I released my latest mock draft on Wednesday, and this was right on the heels of the Bills trading Stephon Diggs to the Texans. If you've looked at the receiving core for the Bills now, it is a bunch of nobodies. Shakir from Boise State, I guess, is a guy that they're counting on, but who is Josh Allen going to throw to? That team is going to be desperate to add receiving talent. And so I look at that 28th pick for the Bills, and I look at Seattle moving down 12 spots. Again, that might seem like a lot, but with that Rich Hill trade chart, you can get the 60th overall selection in the second round and also add a 5th round pick. They don't have a 5th rounder right now, Nick. They traded it away as part of that Sam Howell trade. So you could get a 2nd and a 5th that you currently do not have, and you'd still obviously have a 1st rounder. It would just be late. That might seem a little rich for the Bills, and yet at the same time, if they're wanting to go get a stud receiver, that might be where they have to trade up in this draft to be able to go up and get that player.
Yeah, again, like I said, it takes 2 to tango, and that does make a ton of sense. There's 2 more I like that are kind of in the mid-20s as well. Tampa Bay at 26 makes a lot of sense too, and this is where you can, dropping 10 spots might hurt, but this is also kind of that spot where you can get a 2nd round pick. I really, really don't like the fact that the Seahawks don't have a lot of bites at the apple in round 2. In fact, they don't. Or in day 2, especially. I think I've been saying they have 2 picks within the first 101 picks right now, which I don't like. So dropping down 10 spots gets you the 57th pick from Tampa Bay. And there's still some players there. Just going through simulations. You had an article where Chop Robinson was there. That could be a great fit too. Guys like Latu again from UCLA, Johnny Newton, Illinois. Maybe you pick up a Cooper DeJean and have some fun there with the secondary if he falls down to the 20s. So certainly there's some options there that probably does forego you Jackson Powers Johnson if you want to go down to 26. But the payback, at least with the Tampa Bay one, is you get that 2nd round pick, which again I think is really big. That was my main complaint with the Sam Howell trade. I think that he's a very intriguing quarterback, but I just hate losing bites at the apple at day 2. So you want to get a few of those back.
Yeah, and I think that's another reason why moving down more than 10 picks could be enticing. And I'll get to a trade later here that I'm really excited about that I think could potentially happen. But the Detroit Lions are a team that I'm looking at. They were so close to getting to the Super Bowl. This is one of those teams where you might be one player away from getting to the Super Bowl. And so if they want to move up to add a dynamic player, preferably on defense, that can help get this team over the hump to get to a Super Bowl, I could see the Lions being willing to part ways with a 1st and 2nd round pick as well as a 5th. And again, the Seahawks don't currently have one of those. So the Lions would be a team that makes a lot of sense. And one other team, this is the one I'm excited about, Nick. At pick number 32, I know that this would mean the Seahawks are trading all the way to the back of the 1st round, but I could see a scenario where the Seahawks can add 2 day 2 selections, moving down 16 spots. You still have a 1st rounder, you get a 2nd rounder, and a 3rd rounder from the Chiefs. Kansas City needs a wide receiver bad. It's hard to believe since they just won a Super Bowl with very few guys on the outside for Patrick Mahomes to throw to. But this is a situation where I think if you throw in one of your 2 4th rounders, you can get 2 day 2 selections, and it's near even with the Rich Hill trade chart. So personally, that's the one I'm vouching for right now. If you're going to trade down a bunch, might as well go down to 32. Maybe that really limits who you can get at the end of the 1st round, but you're getting those 2 extra, as you say, bites on the apple on day 2.
Yeah, one more for me too. Green Bay, they're looking for beef in the middle. So this would kind of be a 2-for-2 swap, and that's kind of just how, it broke out with the Rich Hill metrics. You do get back in the 2nd round. You do yield a 6th round pick there, but you get into the 2nd round with pick 58. And then, the Packers are looking for more beef. So that they can get guys like the Chop Robinson, like perhaps a Latu or Johnny Newton there in the middle. Maybe they start getting itchy about wanting a Jackson Powers Johnson or someone in the middle there. And they give you a great offer that the Seahawks really can't refuse, even though you yourself might like Jackson Powers Johnson. But getting, again, getting a second round pick, I think, is vital. I really, with that trade of Sam Howell, I think it's almost imperative that they trade down as much as they can. Maybe still stay in the first round and get a good first round talent, but try to get at least one more bite at the apple in round 2.
And that's why there is some value, as you mentioned, with trading down only 5 or 6 spots, because you do have the option to maybe trade one more time. But I don't know that you're going to get a second rounder out of that. You might end up with 3 third rounders, and maybe that's okay with John Schneider. If that's the best possibility there, then yes, you got more opportunities day 2. But he would love to get a second rounder, which means you're going to likely have to trade down at least 9 or 10 spots in order to do that. You maybe can do 7 or 8, but you'd have to throw in a day 3 pick as part of that deal to really make it work, at least if we're just going strictly off the Rich Hill model. When we come back, we are going to wrap up our Seahawks March Madness Alumni Tournament. We've got the Elite 8 round 8 outstanding squads. They're going to be battling to get to the Final Four and eventually the championship game. We'll be diving into those 4 Elite 8 matchups coming up next year on our Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. That's what brings home the winning trophy, and it's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. You're listening to the Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host, Nick Lee. And a special thanks to all the 12s. Thank you for tuning in and making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. It's time to wrap up our Seahawks Alumni March Madness tournament. We've got the real March Madness Final Four coming up in Arizona. A lot of big boys, including DJ Burns, who I really want to see play tackle in the NFL. So there's some exciting matchups in the basketball world coming up, but we've got some really cool Elite 8 matchups as well, Nick, that we are going to dive into. And starting with the number 1 overall seed, the Texas Longhorns, Earl Thomas, Quandre Diggs, Poona Ford and company, against the Cinderella of our tournament, the 13 seed Ohio State Buckeyes, with Joey Galloway, Sean Springs, and Jackson Smith in Jigba. It's been a wild ride, Nick, at least in my opinion. This feels like the end of the road, and Cinderella's glass slipper is about to break.
It's been a heck of a run for the Buckeyes, for sure. And definitely it's one of those spunky double-digit seeds that you got to watch out for next year, because they're young. You know, with Jackson Smith and Jigba, they could be coming even more so next year. We'll see. But Texas, that's the blue blood right there, with the top 2, one of the top 2 of some of the top 5, top 6 safeties that the Seahawks have had in a long time, maybe ever. There with Earl Thomas and Quandre Diggs. Poona Ford, don't sleep on him. Michael Dixon, very fine punter. I did this the other day, but Ohio State certainly keeps it close with some good athletes there, some playmakers. But I think Michael Dixon, turning into a fine punter, might be the tiebreaker. He might make a big shot late and kind of end the Cinderella run and let the big boys go to the Final Four.
You've got 2 All-Pros on that Texas roster. You've got a 3-time Pro Bowler with the Seahawks and Quandre Diggs, a really solid starting lineman in Brian Millard, and Poona Ford was really solid for a number of years in Seattle. It just feels like that team just has a little too much, and our listeners agree. Texas moving on with almost 70% of the vote. Our next matchup here in the Elite 8, Texas A&M against Florida State. Texas A&M with all the beef. They've got Jacob Green, Michael Bennett, Rocky Bernard, Sam Adams, and Red Bryant. That's a lot of muscle on that roster. And then Florida State with the legendary Walter Jones and more role players on that roster. Leon Washington, Michael Boulware, and former Pro Bowl punter Rick Tootin. So looking at this matchup, you and I both thought Florida State probably should have been out earlier in this tournament, to be honest, but our listeners disagreed. So here's Florida State going up against the 2 seed Texas A&M. This just doesn't feel like a close matchup. This feels like one of those weird Elite Eight games where the wheels falls off for a team. And I think it's going to be for the Florida State Seminoles with, unfortunately, Walter Jones. We know he can push an Escalade, but I don't think he can pick this win up by himself.
Yeah, he might carry the weight for a little bit. He might get hot, make a few shots. But, yeah, I mean, Texas A&M, talk about, like, we were joking last week. If there's, like, an anchorman, like, network fight in the back alley of the parking lot, you do not want to see Texas A&M. You do not want to see those guys. Yeah, I think they're underseeded at 2. I think this is a double-digit comfortable win. Some of the better defensive line players the Seahawks have ever had coming out of College Station.
Yeah, and this one went to Texas A&M in our listener balloting, almost 70% on that one. So a good run for Florida State getting to the Elite Eight, but they're going to need somebody else to come from the Seminoles in coming years to be able to have a chance to get deeper in the tournament because they don't have any current players on that team, and Walter Jones can only do so much. Our next number 1 seed, Miami, they're going up against the upset-minded NC State Wolfpack. And I'm going to be honest with you, Nick, I was really torn on this matchup. When I looked at the rosters, I think Miami's got a little more star power when you're talking about Hall of Famer Cortez Kennedy. Brian Blades put up amazing numbers with poor quarterback play for most of his career. Jimmy Graham, he made 2 Pro Bowls. I know Seahawks fans have some issues with him in his time in Seattle, but he was still really productive. And Darrell Williams earned second-team All-Pro balloting in his brief time in Seattle. And yet on the other side, you've got Russell Wilson. Corn Robinson was good for a few years. J.R. Sweezy started a number of years on the offensive line for the Seahawks as a converted defensive tackle. It feels like this is going to be a tight matchup, and I just think Miami ekes this one up because there's just a little more star power on that roster.
Man, the fact that you have your franchise best leading quarterback that won the Super Bowl and then 2 other starters on the Super Bowl winning team in Sweezy and Hauschka, that pulls a lot of weight for me. So I might tip the scales towards NC State. This could be very, very close. Obviously, Cortez Kennedy, again, one of those like lottery picks, if we're talking, in college basketball terms. He's going to carry a lot of weight himself in more ways than one. But yeah, for me, it's just the franchise quarterback, the Super Bowl title. I think that tips the scale in NC State's in favor for me.
And our listeners, this one was really fun to watch. We did hour-long voting on all these Elite Eight matchups. And with 4 minutes to go, NC State was ahead by a couple percent. But Miami in the final couple minutes, they did what number 1 seeds do when they are on the ropes. They found a way to pull it out. And so Miami is going to the Final Four. And our last Elite Eight matchup, number 7 Alabama, the second highest seed that's still alive after upsetting Michigan in the Sweet 16, going up against number 3 Stanford, Richard Sherman, Doug Baldwin, and Dave Wyman. This feels like a game that could be fairly close because Alabama's feeling frisky. But, Nick, I think the fact that Doug Baldwin was one of the best receivers in franchise history, Richard Sherman is probably the best corner in franchise history, and Dave Wyman was an underrated linebacker. If Alabama had one more player, I would give them the win. But I just feel like Stanford's just got a little too much in a close game.
Well, in the words of that clone during Order 66 with Bail Organa, I'm sorry, sir, it's time for you to leave. And that's Alabama. I'm sorry. It's time for you to leave. You had a great run. You did some good things here. But, man, Stanford is a dangerous team. Richard Sherman, All-Pro, should be Ring of Honor. Doug Baldwin go from undrafted to one of the better receivers in Seahawks history. Dave Wyman, don't sleep on him. And yeah, so sorry, Bama, that was a fun run, but Stanford is one of the sleeping beasts, I think, moving forward.
Fear the tree. The tree is going to the Final Four. Our listeners agreed too, although this one ended up being pretty close. Only a 6% win for Stanford. A lot of fans were bullish on Sean Alexander and Jaron Reed, but Alabama made a valiant run. The Seahawks need another Alabama player. Maybe Dallas Turner is going to be joining the team in the first round, and maybe they could add another guy to this list. And in future tournaments, Alabama can make a deeper run towards a championship in this alumni tournament. When we come back, we have our Final Four set. We're going to dive into those two games, and then we're going to crown a champion as we wrap up our Seahawks Alumni March Madness tournament. You're listening to the Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Robinhood Retirement. Did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood is the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from another retirement account with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on a 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most for your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at Robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Gold for 1 year from the date from the first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA, available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC, member SIPC, is a registered broker-dealer. You're listening to the Blue Friday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, on Blue Friday by my co-host, Nick Lee. And a special thanks to all the 12s tuning in here as we approach Final Four weekend in Phoenix. With those festivities set to come up, we're going to have a champion crowned on Monday night. We're crowning a champion here on Blue Friday on our Seahawks Alumni March Madness tournament. We've got the best of the best, the 4 best teams that have advanced to this point, and it is a stacked Final Four in our Seahawks alumni bracket. Let's get to our first Final Four matchup. It is in the Lone Star State, the battle for the Lone Star State. Texas and Texas A&M, the number 1 and number 2 seeds out of the East region. And Nick, this is one that I was really torn on because we've talked so much about Texas A&M and the beef and the power and all the defensive linemen that they've got on this roster, and yet the flashy play of Earl Thomas, Quandre Diggs, to a lesser extent Poona Ford, even the brilliant punting of Michael Dixon. It feels like this is one that is truly going to be a back-and-forth affair and trying to figure out who's going to win, and that's a difficult one.
I love those games where it's like a clash of styles. You know, they got the bully ball, big guys, the sharpshooters on the other end. And I think this is one of those matchups. And I think Texas has just a little bit more playmaking, a little bit more pedigree on their side. But excuse me, the big men of Texas A&M, they're going to get theirs. They're going to get in foul trouble probably a little bit. I would love to see this play out in real life. I am going to give the slight nod to Texas, the Longhorns, with the upper tier talent of an Earl Thomas. Jacob Green, I think, is like you've been tooting the horn for years and years that he deserves more prestige than he's gotten. But Earl Thomas should be getting that as well. Quandre Diggs still made contributions up until last year, solid contributions. So I think there's just a slight more pedigree on Texas' side. But man, this would be a fun one to watch.
Personally, I look at this matchup, and from a career standpoint, Texas A&M might not have the flashy player like an Earl Thomas, but I mean, I've argued this for years. Jacob Green should be in the Hall of Fame, in my opinion. And the fact that it's never happened, he's never been close. He and Sean Alexander are the 2 biggest misses, in my opinion, with Green number 1, Alexander number 2. And I just look at all the other solid players. Every single one of the guys on Texas A&M's roster was a key player on the defense when they were in Seattle. Sam Adams on some bad teams, but he was really solid the first 4 years before moving on elsewhere. Red Bryant was an unsung hero on those teams early in the Pete Carroll era. Won a Super Bowl in Seattle. Really popular fan favorite. Michael Bennett, multi-time Pro Bowler. I just can't go against the Aggies in this one. I think Texas A&M moves on. Unfortunately, though, I'm not going to get my wish because the listeners agreed with you, Nick, and they've got Texas going. In fact, Texas won by almost 15% in our voting. So the Longhorns, with some of the big names they've got, they are going to the title game here in our Seahawks March Madness Alumni Tournament. Now we got to figure out who they're facing off against. And This is another battle that really is a contrast in styles when you look at Miami versus Stanford. Brian Blades, Jimmy Graham were pretty splashy players. They were flashy in their ability to create big plays as receivers at the receiver position as well as tight end. Darrell Williams kind of had that sparkle to his game, coming up, hitting people, picking off a lot of passes. And on the other side of the equation, Stanford's got the guys that were left behind. Richard Sherman was a fifth-round pick. Doug Baldwin didn't even get drafted. Dave Wyman was an earlier pick, but he was kind of a forgotten man outside of Seattle, despite having some really productive seasons. So this feels like this is a matchup of top pedigree against kind of those guys that were left behind that ended up having a boulder on their shoulder. And it's really hard for me to discount that team that's got the boulder on their shoulders in this one.
Yeah, Stanford reminds me of those teams that have like the 4 fifth-year seniors that maybe didn't get recruited by Kansas or Kentucky. But, the Villanova, they might have a bit more of, the underdog mentality, or, they're not quite, Villanova's a solid program, but they're not North Carolina. They're not Duke, maybe that's not a great example, but, just having those veteran, disrespected guys, those guys make deep runs in the tournament all the time and usually do beat a team like Miami that has one or two, flashy players, but, maybe they're one and dones. This is that kind of matchup where I think Stanford could win. And, Richard Sherman and Doug Baldwin talk about gritty and, disrespected, chip on their shoulders. Those guys have Mount Rainiers on their shoulders, and I think that's going to manifest itself.
This is one of those games where I think if we had to do 10 simulations, one team would win 5 games and the other one would win 5 games. It truly is 50-50. I think if it was just one and done like this to move on, though, I cannot go against Richard Sherman and Doug Baldwin. I just can't do it. So I've got the Stanford Cardinal moving on. It sounds like you have leaned that direction as well. Our listeners agreed. Stanford with a narrow win over Miami. They are going as a 3 seed to the championship game. So without further ado, our title matchup, what we've all been waiting for. Number 1 seed Texas against number 3 seed Stanford. And from a numbers standpoint, Texas clearly has got the advantage here with 5 guys in the roster that were significant contributors from Texas. Stanford's got 3. We could have put Colby Parkinson on here, I guess, but at the end of the day, Colby Parkinson wouldn't have moved the needle in this matchup. But the 3 guys that Stanford's got, I think you can make an argument there's more star power overall than what Texas has. But Texas has got the numbers. This is the championship game you want because, again, it's got that contrasting styles a little bit, but you've got the Legion of Boom flavor on both sides here. You've got the toughness, the tenacity. This is what you want. And so trying to pick this one is extremely difficult. And we've mentioned it a few times, Nick, and we'll see where you stand on this, but I just can't see this Texas team finding a way to win this one. I just think Stanford, they are a team of destiny in this tournament. You just can't go against Richard Sherman and Doug Baldwin. We saw in the past what happens. Doubt those, they typically lose. And I think in this case, Earl Thomas has got some help, but I just don't know for a 1 seed that Texas has the dominance to win this one.
Well, no, they're not impeccable for sure. They're not without fault. And Richard Sherman and Doug Baldwin talk about, contrasting mentalities, contrasting resumes. You got Earl Thomas, Quandre Diggs, Earl Thomas, the blue blood, first round pick, all the pedigree. And then you got that, blue blood kind of first round lottery kind of thing. And then you got Stanford with Richard Sherman and Doug Baldwin, late in the draft, undrafted, angry, grumpy, chip on the shoulder. I like that a lot. And that can really take them a long way. I do wonder, it's one of those things where the longer the game goes, maybe the talent and the pedigree take over at the, when the chips are all down and, both teams are equally tired and fighting. Maybe Texas has this slight upper hand. I am fascinated to see how this ends because this would be like, you could only ask for something like this in March or in April, I guess, where it's, two teams like this, one, hungry, disrespected, hot, the other just blue blood, just the evil empire kind of team. I'm really excited to see who wins. I'm probably going to lean Texas just with just a slight more depth, but we'll see.
Yeah, this one, it was another one where I really felt like Two-Face. I just need to flip a coin and then I'll make my decision there. But In the end, I'm going with Stanford to win it all. I look at this run that they've had, and I like this matchup. And quite frankly, the trifecta of players they have really is a nice blend of players for this tournament. And I don't think Brian Millard or Michael Dixon or even Poona Ford moves the needle like all three players for Stanford's roster do. And Nick, we have been following the voting on this tonight. It was just a 30-minute vote, but there was not a game in this entire tournament that had a back and forth in voting. 1 second, Stanford would be ahead. The next second, Texas would be, and it went back and forth. And then the last 5 minutes, Stanford actually had a 10% advantage, and it looked like Cardinal are going to win this one. And then stunningly, in the closing moments, Texas denies them. The voting was 50.9% to 49.1%. It was easily the tightest game that we had in this entire tournament. It's fitting that it was the championship game that happened. So the number one seeded Longhorns, they are the first ever Seahawks alumni March Madness champions. As you argued, it really boils down to the star power, the fact they have 5 really solid players in their roster. Got to this point and they outmuscled Stanford in that David versus Goliath matchup, and they get the tight win. So Texas wins, and this is something I think we'll have to go to every couple of years, I think, because we could see this draft a few guys coming from some of the schools that were in this tournament, maybe some newcomers. Maybe UTSA gets a new guy on the team to go with Reek Woolen, and suddenly UTSA gets into the dance. I think this will be something that's really fun for us to continue doing every couple of years here on Locked On Seahawks. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Nick at NickLeave51. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks wherever you listen to your podcasts, and make sure that you don't miss a single episode. When we come back on Monday, Rob Rang and I are going to be diving into the latest expert mock drafts out there, and we're going to go back to the offensive line, checking out some center prospects the Seahawks may have some interest in. You won't want to miss it. Enjoy your weekend, and thanks for listening in. Go Hawks.